Okay, thanks, Mick. Doing a great job. Well, thanks everyone for coming. It's great to see a big crowd here, and we've got probably 47 of our employees here. We've got our board members. We've got many of our clients from around the world, many of our business partners who we've worked with over the years, the board of directors of Forest Trends from around the world. So it's a fantastic group, and I hope during the course of today and this evening you'll have a chance to meet many of the interesting people that are here. And to me, business is really all about people, and so all of you have had a role to play in terms of the development and success of our business. So thank you very much. Okay, well, what I thought I would talk about today is what I've seen in our 10 years in business and our philosophy of investment and how we think about the forestry sector, and then close with a few thoughts on the future. And it's very interesting when you sit down and reflect. We started July 1, 2005, and in those days there was no iPhone and iPad, and people actually read newspapers. And China was a wood chip exporter. And Japan had 90% of the world trade in wood chip, hardwood wood chip. The US was at nearly the peak of the housing cycle with about 1.5 million units being built. Australia's forestry sector was 90% owned by governments and managed investment schemes. There was about $40 billion of institutional investment in forestry, but we were in the last stages of the rationalization of the U.S. Forestry sector into institutional ownership. And think about what's happened in those 10 years. The whole dissemination of information has become based on electronic devices. We've had the U.S. go through an extraordinarily wrenching recession, with housing starts going from 1.5 million down to 500,000, and now recovering partly at least to about 1.2 million units. But we haven't seen anything like that in the last 50, 60 years at least. China has risen to become one of the great markets for forest products in the world, and literally the structure of trade in the forestry sector has fundamentally changed. Australia today has probably almost 60% of the forestry sector owned by institutional investors. The managed investment scheme industry is completely gone. Governments are largely exiting from forestry. New Zealand, similarly, major institutional investment in that sector. And today, I think the total investment in forestry is increased by 250% to about $100 billion of institutional capital, including the timber REITs in the US. So it's an enormous set of changes that have occurred just in 10 years. And it used to be, I remember when I was in university learning about forestry, they were talking about how, the first textbook on forestry was written by the Romans and nothing ever changes in forestry. Well, we're no different from a lot of sectors of the economy in terms of the nature of continuous change that's happening, and in fact it almost seems to be accelerating. So I've had the pleasure of running a business during that 10 years and trying to understand all those changes and how it affects our business. And certainly we started out with a very simple business model. We had clients who would give us an allocation. We would go out and find forestry assets to buy and manage those, and it was relatively straightforward until we hit the financial crisis in 2008, and then many of our clients got into some difficulty. And at that point, we took the crazy idea that we should become a funds management business. And it just so happened that timing was propitious, because it was at that point, coming out of the huge volatility of the financial crisis, that there was a search for high-quality real assets, forestry, agriculture, infrastructure, real estate that could be quite stable long-term assets in an investment portfolio. And so our idea was to create a set of clearly enunciated investment strategies that we could offer to our clients, who are institutional investors, that would understand the market dynamics and opportunities, set strategies for that, and then build the team that could execute on those strategies. And I'm quite proud of really what our company and our team has been able to do over the last 5 years, particularly, working through trying to restructure the managed investment scheme industry of Australia into high-quality, institutionally owned assets has been a huge amount of work and effort, but I think we've got there now, and it was fantastic being down in Tasmania earlier this week with Foraco and Timberlands Pacific and Timberlink at the sawmill. Everything is going extremely well. Everyone's back at work, getting paid on time. The nursery's full of seedlings, and it just looks great. And so I'm very proud of that. I'm also very proud of the fact that we've been one of the first companies that have moved to bring institutional capital into Asia. It's been hard work, but it's an important mission. If you think about the history of unsustainable harvesting in that region, and today we're migrating to a plantation-based system that will support future wood demand, and certainly that's an area that we want to continue to emphasize in our business. And finally, in the United States, I think we've carried on with really one of our missions from the very start of the company, which was to be involved in conservation finance and looking at how carbon, water, and biodiversity-related values could be monetized. And our team there in San Francisco has become one of the leaders in terms of the carbon market in California, and has done some great transactions with Native American Indian tribes that have provided funding to them that not only lets them better manage their forests, but potentially to acquire more of their traditional land. So it's just great stepping back and looking at those things, and the fact that investment capital can be transformative and can create those kind of lasting benefits. And I guess for me, as Mick kind of said, I've had a kind of an eclectic career in forestry. Started out working, I think, as a tree planting foreman when I was 18 in northern Saskatchewan, and then ended up as a hall boss north of Lake Superior, worked in the bush in coastal British Columbia. I got laid off in 1982 in one of the recessions and went back and got a PhD by accident. And I was a scientist for a couple of years, and then went into the federal government in Ottawa in Canada and worked on trade negotiations and some of the environmental convention negotiations running up to the Earth Summit, and then the precursor of the Kyoto Protocol, which was COP1 in Bonn. But I then made the choice to come down to Australia with my family, and after a year or so they told me that they were staying even if I wanted to go back to Canada. So I've been here for 20 years. So I've now basically spent half my career in Canada and half in Australia. And I think that's really interesting because, when you look at the nature of the forestry sector, you do have those huge reservoirs of timber in places like Russia and Canada, and then you have this new emerging plantation-based sector in the Southern Hemisphere. And I've had the opportunity to work in both of those environments. But to me, launching New Forest, really, that's the culmination of all my career and my experience. And I think, if there's one thing I can bring to the company, it's a frame of reference. Having worked in forestry in so many diverse roles, it does help me to understand change and trends that are affecting the forestry sector. And along the way, it would be remiss not to say I've also been a member of the board of Forest Trends, and many of the board members have come here today to help us celebrate, and that's been a fantastic experience with a group of people from around the world who have provided me a lot of insights and different views on how forestry is changing in different parts of the world. So as David said in his introductory remarks, investment in forestry is increasingly important. And now in some regions of the world, particularly North America, Australia, New Zealand, it's the primary source of financing for forestry. And I think with that comes some obligations that I want to talk about today. We've really taken charge of many of the forestry assets in Australia where communities rely on the management of those forests for local employment and for conservation outcomes, and we have an obligation in that area. When we think about Asia, I think there's a great opportunity to facilitate a shift in the forestry sector there to a sustainable basis. In the US, I think there's the opportunity to move beyond just a simple timberland investment approach to look at more resegmenting that market into new conservation-based investment strategies. And ultimately, what I would like to see and what I hope will happen is that we will have a world where institutional investment can support both conservation and production on a commercial basis, and that ultimately we can reach landscapes that are stable and that we have both natural ecosystems and highly productive timber plantations in balance. Well, our philosophy as a company really is that we look to manage our assets on a commercial basis. We're in business to support the needs of our clients, and we do think about 4 ways that we can add value to forestry assets. The first is in productivity and enhancing the productivity of our timber plantations. Certainly we're interested in genetics and nutrition and pest control and all of the technologies that can help us grow more wood on every hectare and help meet growing demands for timber and biomass. Secondly, we look at cost reduction and efficiency. Where we operate, we want to be internationally competitive, and that means working with all of our business partners and people in the supply chain to be as efficient and competitive as possible, so there's more return to the owners of the trees. And thirdly, we like to be engaged in market development and active in looking at ways to diversify markets. And certainly for me, we didn't start out intending to be sawmill owners, but we've become sawmill owners with Timberlink, and that has been a fantastic learning experience in terms of how value is created along the supply chain. And I think particularly as we look to the future, it's that partnership between the production of timber in the forests and the processing and ultimate use where value can be created. And finally is risk reduction. And I'm not just thinking about fire and insect and disease, but the forestry sector has often got into difficult relationships with stakeholders and communities, and if you have dysfunctional relationships with your stakeholders and your communities, it's very hard to make money. And so that's why I think our company has embraced the concept of shared value, and what we mean by that is that the returns to our clients are as important as the benefits to the communities where we operate, and those are joint goals, and we don't believe that if we don't create benefits to the communities where we operate, we're not going to make money, and if we're not making money, we're not going to be able to invest in our assets and generate returns. So those two things are joint and inseparable. And part of that is communicating our principles and our philosophy and how we expect to operate, and I think there's sort of 3 or 4 basic fundamentals. The first is we're very aligned with our clients in that we don't want to leverage our assets. We have very limited use of debt, so most of our investments are equity funded, which means that they're very low in risk and able to ride out difficult times of poor market conditions. Secondly, we are focused on the fundamentals of economic return, whether that be improving the value of our assets or generating stronger cash yield from those forests. And thirdly, we look to the long term, and increasingly I think institutional ownership needs to be longer horizon, and that means then we need to be actively engaged in research and development. We need to think about capital expenditures that's going to increase efficiency and productivity. And so for us, really I think you sum it up by we're trying to build something. We're not trying to strip profits and just make a short-term gain. We're trying to build something that increases in value over time, and I think that has to be the mentality of the forestry sector going forward. Okay, well, just to close out with a couple of thoughts on the future, I think certainly for us, working with clients that have long-term pension liabilities or paying out medical benefits to retirees or operating pools of shared risk through insurance facilities. First and foremost, we're looking to help manage those liabilities through how we manage these assets. And certainly I think there's increasing sophistication in that process. But I also think there's a recognition that many of these assets need to be held for longer periods of time, even as perpetual evergreen type of vehicles. That's an important emerging trend, and I think that's very aligned with thinking about sustainability and how we're going to deliver value to the communities where we operate. But also, I think there's a lot more sophistication about understanding the origin of returns, what's driving the performance of assets in terms of components like growth rate and market pricing and land value and so on. All these things integrate to generate returns, and increasingly we need to understand those factors and how we can intervene to improve them. But we also can't rest on our laurels and just manage our forests and grow them and plant them and so on, because we're in this turbulent environment. And I don't think that the last 10 years was unusual. I think going forward we're going to see more turbulence, more change. I think there's going to be fundamental changes in terms of materials, construction, land management, genetics, information sciences, all of those things that swirl around the forestry sector and many other sectors of the economy. And I think one of the big trends that we may well see reach scale in the next 10 years is this idea of a shift towards a bioeconomy, where we increasingly move away from fossil fuels and fossil energy and petrochemicals into biofuels and bioenergy and biochemicals, increasing use of wood fiber for fabrics and other type of materials, whole restructuring of construction systems as we move to a more densification of human society into urban environments, and changes in construction systems using new engineered materials like the CLT systems and how that will affect forestry. And I think one of the greatest challenges will be how do we grow enough wood and biomass to meet all of those emerging opportunities as we try to create an overall international society that is sustainable in its basis. And in forestry, I literally think that we're going to end up with a continuum between agriculture and forestry as we have ever more intensified fiber production and shortening rotations and increasing productivity. It's going to become an increasingly intensified crop. And the last, I think, trend has to be related to conservation and the environment and natural ecosystems. And in the next 6 or 7 years, we're probably going to reach a gross world product of $100 trillion. And the weight of that economy is on a finite portfolio of ecosystems. And the value of those ecosystems in terms of fresh water, in terms of carbon storage, pollination, other biodiversity values, is going to get more and more acute. And so I think one of the things that our company is very keen on is how we can start to develop investments that almost operate like natural infrastructure that can support not only intensification of timber production, but also funding to retain conservation in the landscape for those ecosystem services. So thanks again for coming, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the program today. We've got a lineup of fantastic speakers, and I also look forward to having the chance to talk to each of you during the course of today and this evening. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we on? So now's your opportunity to, we've heard Dave's view on the outlook of the forestry investment landscape, and now you've got an opportunity to ask him some challenging, interesting questions. We've got any in the audience to kick off with? No? Over here. Oh, sorry, hiding behind the post.
Thanks. Ross Hampton from AFPA. Congratulations, New Forests, and David and everyone. David, you talk a lot about growing more productivity from the existing estates, but you didn't touch at all on adding to the estate, new land and new plantings. Could you have a little say about that?
Well, they're basically intertwined because if you can increase your productivity and generate a higher return on forestry investment, then you will naturally expand forestry investment. So I think the first step is let's take our existing plantation base, let's get the right technology, genetics, and silvicultural management, improve our profitability through strengthening our supply chains, and then that will come because we'll be a profitable sector that will be able to expand our investment.
Great. Do we have any other questions? Hands going up anywhere? Yep, one over here. Sally?
Yeah, David, what's the most important role for government in all of this?
Spoken as the former deputy head of the U.S. Forest Service. Look, I think that, it's interesting when you look at Australia, New Zealand, the United States, where we do have stable economies. We have, basically the rule of law. We have the ability to feel confident with long-term investments. There's infrastructure in place. There's research, development, education. It's all that kind of soft infrastructure that governments really have to operate that makes any industry successful. And I think forestry, particularly being such a long-term venture, needs to be in countries that have got that kind of stability and investment environment.
Right down the front here, please, with the microphone.
Hi, David. Rod Keenan, University of Melbourne. You spoke about forestry becoming more intensified, or timber production at least becoming, and the crop becoming more intensified, more like agriculture. But I guess others are saying that agriculture needs to become more like traditional forestry and integrating multiple values, conservation benefits, other values off the same area of land. So which it's been described as either land sharing or land sparing in terms of whether you divide uses or try and achieve them off the same area of land. Which way do you see things going?
Okay, well, it kind of comes back to what I was saying about having worked half my career in Canada and half in Australia, and wondering how to answer this. I mean, the world cuts about 1.7 billion cubic meters of wood a year. About 1 billion cubic meters of that comes from extensive sort of reservoirs of natural and semi-natural forests, and about 700 million of that comes from timber plantations. And it is apparent to me that all increases in production will come from timber plantations. And what we don't want to do is systematically continue to erode natural ecosystems to plant more trees. What we want to do is grow more on each hectare, and I think it's the same in agriculture and forestry. But we want to accommodate at the landscape scale conservation and production. And I think that's a land use planning kind of a concept, but it means that we have an obligation where we are in a productive system to be as productive as possible, so we don't need to, gain more land. So I think that's my concept. But on the other hand, if we don't make the conservation side of the equation profitable, it's inevitable the economics just keep pressing against it. So that's why I think we need value in both sides of the coin.
Hi, sorry, over here.
Sorry.
Behind the other post, yes. Bettina Von Hagen, EcoTrust Forest Management. So as we establish more plantations around the world, and there's competing uses for trees, for agriculture, and for rangeland, for livestock, have you considered or thought about sort of integrated production models, or integrating agriculture with timber, with livestock, And what might that look like in the Australian context or in the Asian context?
Yeah, I think, when you think about these new emerging ideas of big data and how land is used, it starts to get down to an ever more granular scale of what crops and grazing and cropping and irrigation and forestry and how that's allocated. There's going to be a lot of pressure to have optimal allocation of land into these different crops and products. And I think we're starting to see, how that's being done in the U.S. is creating a significant new enhancement in productivity through that fine scale allocation. But I think it's the same thing when I think about some of these big estates that we've acquired, whether it's Foraco or the former Great Southern Plantations, which is now the Forestry Investment Trust. Those have been kind of established in a somewhat random fashion. And now it's like, well, we have to go back and extract value from restructuring, reconsolidating that land into the appropriate uses. And I think there is a big job here, particularly in Australia, but also to some degree maybe in New Zealand, to look at how that land is optimally used.
Have we got time for one or two more questions? If there's anyone, yep, over here please with the microphone. Thanks, Maria.
Bill Hutnett, Local Government Super. G'day, Dave.
Hi, Bill.
Just wondering your comment about forestry and biofuels, and just wondering what you see as the opportunities now and the future in terms of biofuels being competitive with solar and wind, or low carbon types of both stationary and also transport type energy. Do you see it playing a big role or small or just middling?
Yeah, I mean, the economics right now of
I'd like to know its carbon footprint also, ramifications.
Okay. Well, the economics right now, I think, are favoring wind and solar in terms of electricity generation. But we are seeing certainly a role for biomass in some instances, particularly in some regions where solar and wind are maybe less effective. We've certainly seen a huge increase in trade in wood pellets into Europe, but now increasingly also into Korea and Japan. I think the challenge is densification of that energy so that we're not transporting a lot of water and low embodied energy materials around the world. But in terms of biofuels, even with the price of oil being very low at the moment, it's like the old quote from, what was it, Sheikh Yamani, I think it was the Saudi oil minister who said that the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. And I think there is a fundamental recognition that we are going to have to shift out of fossil energy and fossil fuels, and so we're going to need a whole range of systems that can be renewable, and forestry is the ultimate renewable resource. We can grow trees forever, and so I think it has a significant role in this transition to a bio-based economy.
One question over here. Thanks, Maria.
I didn't think we'd get any questions. This is incredible.
Just a nightmare, Maria.
Should have put on my running shoes.
What's that? I promised someone a beer, Dave, so it's amazing what people will do.
All right, thanks, Mick.
Joshua Bishop from Worldwide Fund for Nature. Thanks, Dave. Could you comment a little bit on the demand side and what trends you're seeing in terms of your customers for forest products and their recognition and preference for shared value and conservation benefits?
Yeah. Well, certainly to us, when you look at the market for wood products, it's a one-way flow. There's certainly some markets that in the past disregarded the nature of where their resources came from, but that's steadily shrinking. And now even Chinese buyers who in the past didn't have much concern are now looking for example, FSC certification of wood products. So I think it is steadily becoming essential that you have a pedigree of sustainably managed resources if you're going to be successful in the market. And I know we had a discussion at the Foraco board meeting a couple of weeks ago, and Brian was showing us the list of, these are all the customers that you get when you become FSC certified that you don't have when you're not FSC certified. And so when you're running a business, having that greater diversification of clients is a way to become more competitive and more successful.
Great. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking David Green.